everyone, and welcome to this episode of OVPLT Talks. And I'm delighted to be joined today by Dr. Sarah Thelen from SATLE, and we're going to be talking about a very topical issue, that of generative AI. But before we dive into that, Sarah, would you say a little bit about yourself? I mean, how did you come to be with us? Your accent would suggest you're not from West Cork.
No, I trained as a historian in the States and moved here about 14 years ago now. My husband's from Cork, and I finished my PhD and then started working in instructional design, and I still teach a bit of history, but now I'm teaching digital education. So it's a very roundabout path.
Good. And coming back to generative AI, I understand yourself and Dr. Loretta Goff in the Skills Centre were honoured recently by the HEA with the SATLE Impact Award for your work on generative AI.
Yeah, no, that was... Thank you. Yeah, it's very exciting. We were one of 4 national recipients of this sort of first-time award, which is the award sought to recognize previously funded SATLE work that seemed to have potential to move forward and go in different directions. So Loretta and I were recognized for our work on academic integrity and Gen AI and assessment and digital education, sort of how all of those came together over the past year and a half or so. And so then we're going to be doing a project in the coming year with the funding from the SATLE Award that will kind of look to see, thinking about assessment beyond Gen AI, because something's coming next and we just don't know what.
Yeah, as I've never seen anything to capture the attention of the academy as quickly as ChatGPT and generative AI and so on. And some staff have argued that all of this new adventures in generative AI kind of almost requires a return to the rigor of the exam hall. I mean, will that solve their problems around cheating?
Unfortunately for them, no. And maybe that's a good thing for those of us who see other forms of assessment as having utility. But as technology changes and as Gen AI evolves, you both have that sort of problem of what I've been told about the Leaving Cert. I didn't take it myself, but that sometimes people will learn off an answer before going in to take the test. So there's nothing that prevents that from happening in an exam hall setting. And there's a lot of sort of, as things change and evolve and technology becomes even more enmeshed in our lives, we really need to think beyond these sort of really hardline, almost punitive approaches, because there's a lot of accessibility and inclusion issues around.
And what would you recommend to staff instead?
I really advocate for sort of redesigning or looking at your assessment design kind of from the ground up. And part of that then requires you to get a familiarity with generative AI and what it can do and how it relates to your discipline, but then also kind of go back to your assessment and think about what is that assessment actually setting out to do? And is that form of assessment you've chosen the best way to check those kind of learning objectives? And if they don't match, think about how you can change those.
And in terms of that, I mean, what ways have UCC staff changed or maybe adapted their assessments?
Yeah, so there's been a really exciting range of ways that staff have thought about this. So you have people who are sort of sticking to a no generative AI, and then they're kind of implementing process assessments or versioning, which I know someone who has used a version of that as well, where it's really looking at emphasizing to students that this production of work is a process and getting a glimpse into that process through few different methods. But you also have people going kind of on the other extreme of really integrating generative AI into their assessment very intentionally and purposefully. And there's some really fun examples of that, like kind of collaborating with Gen AI on a business plan, giving generative AI a Turing test, and then reassessing and using your learning from the module to kind of evaluate and analyze that conversation, to explain why you gave a prompt that you did, to critique the responses, and kind of just to engage with it in a really critical way. And both of sort of those two extremes kind of represent how broad these ways of rethinking assessment are. It doesn't mean you have to make huge changes. It's just sort of looking at what you're valuing.
Exactly, and as you might have inferred there, I've had a bit of success with versioning down through the last year or so, where I get a OneDrive document on my own OneDrive that I share with each student. It keeps the versions. Not sure is it really a solution, but one thing it does, and one thing I hope that this will come out, is that it's going to hopefully bring the lecturer and the students closer together. I think more personal contact, I think, is the secret sauce in a lot of these
Yeah,
issues,
absolutely.
you know?
And I think it's also really important to emphasize a lot of times that what we're interested in as teachers is the learning, and that final output represents a certain type of learning, but it's not necessarily that final single product that matters. And the more I think we can emphasize to students that it's a larger process, that your learning is evolving, and that's what we value, I think can remove some of the temptation to make this sort of objectively really beautiful, polished final product doesn't have that same value necessarily, depending on what it is that you're valuing in the learning process.
And if you had to give one piece of advice to staff, I mean, in terms of changing and modifying their assessment, what would jump into your mind?
It's kind of that reiteration of what I was saying before about looking at your goal for the assessment and really clearly articulating that so that you could tell a student why I've assigned this. And then once you've pinned that down, look really hard at that assessment and say, like, is this actually the best way to do this? Because when there's a disconnect, I think that's when you start creating spaces for students to wonder, why am I doing this? What's the point? And it's just to be really clear with yourself and then really clear and transparent with the students. Like, why am I giving you an assessment? You're learning this. The assessment's designed this way. And if you can't explain it, that's the point where you maybe need to sit down and really think through, why are you doing this assessment and what's happening here? Because the more you can explain it, I think the more you can get the students to understand why they need to do it a certain way.
And so finally, I mean, what supports have you available for UCC staff?
So there's a pretty broad range. You mentioned Loretta Goff at the beginning, and she's in the Skills Center, and she led a great project on generative AI and artificial intelligence and academic integrity, and built a sort of toolkit for the ethical use of Gen AI in teaching and learning. And what she and I have been doing in our work beyond that, and some of the work I've been doing as well, is adding to that toolkit. So that toolkit's very much a living document and evolving as we go. And so I wrote a short guide on assessment and generative AI that's housed on the SATLE site, but linked out of the toolkit. And then more recently, we've been doing work with staff to kind of guide them through that process I just described of writing a generative AI statement for your students to really clarify to them when you can use it, when you can't. So there's those resources. That's kind of a step-by-step page to kind of walk you through the process. We've run workshops, and we're also sort of convening a journal club to start building a bit of a community of practice of people who are interested in these ideas, and get everybody together and start sort of talking about how these things play out for ourselves.
It's hugely important. This is such a fast-moving topic, isn't it? You blink, something else has come up.
And that's the thing, is it is just constantly moving. And so what we're hoping with the journal club is that there's a small presentation on the journal article, so that you don't necessarily have to have read to come. to encourage people to come, and sort of that someone will present on those core ideas, and then we can talk about implications, and it's fun.
Sarah Thelen, thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul.